Hi, everyone. Welcome to Satire Can Save Us All. This is the webcast where we talk about satire and cartooning around the globe in the era of coronavirus. In this episode, I get a great conversation with Patrick Chappatte. He's the global and international award-winning cartoonist based in Geneva, Switzerland. We also have a little chat with our friend Alexandra Bowman, our satire correspondent, who's been looking at a few cartoons and it's got a couple of questions. And then we close out with our good friend Muppet in Chief, Mr. Bowser McSchnauzer. So first, let's get straight to the interview. Let me introduce you to Patrick Chappatte. Patrick Chappatte is one of the world's truly great global cartoonists. He draws cartoons each month for newspapers and magazines in Germany, France, Switzerland, and the United States. He's also a pioneer of graphic journalism or comics journalism and has developed collaborative projects promoting cartooning as a tool for dialogue all around the world. Recently, I caught up with Patrick in his studio in Geneva and wanted to ask a question which has always fascinated me about his particular line of work. This is what makes you kind of a really unique artist and cartoonist, because you have done cartoons in various different languages, right? You've done cartoons in English and in French. Have you done cartoons in German as well? Is that correct?
I still do. Yes, I still do. Yeah.
Now you take like this as perfectly normal, and this is a very curious and tricky thing, I imagine, for most people, in that there is cultural differences, personality differences, as you allude to when you're talking about the difference of the Swiss Germans, the way they behave and culturally, and the French. I'm curious first about that exercise of shifting from one culture to another. Tell us a little bit about that process.
Yes, true. It's true that I still work in different languages. I have French, which is as you can hear, I guess, my mother language. So I work for Le Temps, which is here in Geneva. And I now work for Le Canard Enchaîné, which is a very well-known satirical newspaper in France, in Paris. Then I do work in German. I've been working for Swiss-German newspapers for like 20 years. Now it's the Neue Zürcher Zeitung am Sonntag. You can hear my accent, very good German accent, right? And this is a Sunday newspaper in Zurich. And I also do a weekly cartoon for Der Spiegel, which is a German news magazine, very well known, one of the few last great news magazines in print, like Time magazine in the US. And I, as you know, I've been living in the US. I have a kid who was born in New York, lived for a few years in New York, and then in Los Angeles most recently. And I have worked for American newspapers, the New York Times, for a while, until they stopped publishing cartoons. Maybe you heard of that.
Right.
In 2009. Mm-hmm. And happy to say I contribute to the Boston Globe. Oh. Yes, 2 cartoons a month, so that's great. Keeping a foot in the US. And missing you guys, by the way. Mm. So to your question, I don't have 2 or 3 different brains. I'm not sure I do. I can work in English because I lived there for a long time. I can think in English in a way. I can look for ideas in English. Between you and me, I cannot work in German. My German is not good enough. I don't know who could, actually. German is really tricky. Mm-hmm. But so I do send them my sketches in English, and that's interesting. From French in my brain to English and then German through the translation. But I can, Switzerland is a funny place. We studied German as the French minority. I studied German for 7 years. And my German is still not good enough to draw in German, but I can have a sense of the language. So when they send me the translation, sometimes I would say, are you sure this sounds right? And so we work on the translation. But I do work in 2 different languages. I don't think differently. Now you could look at the readership of those different newspapers. If you talk about the New York Times, if you talk about the Spiegel, if you talk about Le Temps, which is a quality newspaper in Geneva, you're talking about the same kind of cosmopolitan, educated readership. And you would be surprised that actually there's not many differences in the interests and feelings or thoughts or maybe, I don't know, of the culture of that readership, be it in Germany, in France, or in the US, or in Switzerland. Of course, there are differences. I'm sometimes, surprised by little differences in perception. We could go into, but that would be a long study to have, go into the differences of cultural humor, the forms of humor that work better for a US audience or for a Swiss or French audience. But I do work the same way. I try to come up with the best possible ideas, and then I have an exchange with the journalists, and we try to, see what works.
Well, I know that even in my experience working in the UK and the US, even though they both speak English, the cartoons, as you point out, the audiences might be different in some ways. There's some crossover, particularly in the audience that you're mainly targeting, but there's cultural references, isn't there? I mean, for example, in England, I can't use an American football or American baseball metaphor in a cartoon, but I can.
What do you mean by football exactly? That's one of the differences.
That's right. Well,
when you say football, are you saying soccer? Are you saying football?
Yeah, maybe cricket is a better metaphor to use there. So there's maybe a little bit of those, but also I found that even when you talk about, say, using children's books as metaphors, England would have certain references there compared to the U.S. Are you finding those kind of they're small little differences, but from the pool of things that help you make your cartoons work, are there differences in those areas?
Oh, I can see a legion of small and big differences, but to be very broad, I do think that the Germans, for example, if you take the German culture, they do appreciate the visual, graphical aspect of cartooning and the speechless idea, the timeless, speechless idea, very graphical. The UK, they are a league of their own in terms of the culture, the humor. Well, you could talk about that better than me. So I've never worked for a UK newspaper. I actually did start once, but that's a story I can tell later. I did try working for the Time of London, and it lasted only one day. But I would say the French and maybe also the US audiences are more interested in the verbal humor, in the situational humor. In the French love a good wordplay. They like to play with words very much. That's not so big in the US culture, but I can see that of the sketches that I submit to my friends at the Boston Globe, they would be more interested in the comical aspect of the situation, in the wording, in the punchline, more than the graphical, strong, punchy idea.
Interesting.
What is your feeling? Did you come up with the same findings?
Yeah, it's what's interesting is both in the U.S. and the U.K. is that if there's going to be a broad brush, and that's what you were talking about, broad brush, I would say that the U.K. is generally understated humor, America's overstated humor. The jokes are a little bit more apparent and a little bit loud and vivacious. However, there are great examples in Britain of overstated humor. Monty Python is overstated. And then there's a great examples of understated humor like Mark Twain in the United States. So there is, even within those cultures, a broad place. And so it's depending on where you stand and where you sit. And what I think is interesting about your work is that you've been doing this a long time. You've created thousands and thousands of cartoons. You have the ability of doing both overstated and understated cartoons, depending on the nature of what's presenting itself in the world today. And it'll be curious one day, for example, to take a story, a given story, and to think about how Patrick would cover that story in French, German, and English, and whether it be the same cartoon but just translated differently, or whether it would require a completely different drawn cartoon?
Well, I do sometimes, and more often than I should, I do sometimes use my cartoons and translate them for my different audiences.
Okay.
I have no study, to find out if they work better there or here. But the fact is, I think it is enriching me to have the ability, the capacity to work with different audiences, because I can try to look at things with different angles, and maybe my audiences can benefit also from that little, step aside that I'm taking, maybe from, as you say, there is no doubt I would cover things differently and think of things differently if I were U.S. born, had lived all my life in the U.S. And I think the same goes for you. You have lived in the U.K. You've had that cultural exchange, and I'm sure this has enriched you and your experience as a cartoonist and as a person. And I'm sure this has translated in your work in a way or another. I don't think we are trying to adapt too much or work to this or that outlet and audience, but still we are instilling a level of complexity in the way we approach the topics. And I think this turns out in one way or another in the work we do. And it's a good thing.
Yes.
It's a good thing to have, to have those different views and approaches.
No, I agree completely. So one of the things
you do have, for example, in the French media, you do have cartoonists that come from other cultures, and sometimes their French is not perfect, and you can see that in the cartoons. But you can feel that each of them has a different sensitivity, a different style, and this brings a lot to the world of cartooning, I do believe. And that's a chance we do have. You, Kal, and I were one of the few remaining international cartoonists. There are not many of us in a time of, narrowing borders, especially now, where we have closed borders for now 2 months. Strange time we're going through. And so it is one of the few areas, cartoons, one of the few languages that can cross border and jump over walls and have this communication between different cultures. That's just great.
It is great. It is great. And one of the things that something you said sparked an interest in me is that for a time there was many of the top cartoonists in Great Britain were all foreign cartoonists. People came from Australia, Poland, other places like that, and many people believed that because they came in with an outsider's perspective, that they were able to almost to see the culture clearer. And in a funny sort of way, I recognize that when I was in the UK, one of the things that it allowed me to do when I was criticizing any given party, I could do that without feel like I'm betraying my own tribe that I grew up with. And I'm curious, because I'm going to make this specific about the U.S. You came to work to the U.S. The world kind of knows the U.S. from films and culture that pervades everywhere. But you come in, and not only are you living in the U.S., but you now have to criticize it or critique it to an American audience, not to a Swiss audience. Do you feel that you come in and you actually it gives you, being outsider helps you in some sort?
Well, first, you don't need any foreigners to criticize the U.S. You my fellow American colleagues, you have just the best cartoonists and very, very strong, signatures. And that's, of course, that's not the point. But I do believe that it's interesting to. And also, it's not hard to, look at the U.S. and criticize it, at least from the outside. You can't imagine the interest in U.S. politics everywhere in the world. It's just the focus of everybody in Europe is a specialist of the US. They have some misconceptions, and that's not always very subtle, the way they look at the US. But it is, I think, interesting to look at the US, come to the US, and speak to a US audience with a different perspective. And that's actually when I started working for the International Herald Tribune. The task was to draw and speak both to an international audience, which means anyone, anywhere. It's very hard to grasp what is an international audience, and at the same time speak to a US audience. And that became even stronger when it turned into I switched to the New York Times, mostly online in New York Times international editions and the New York Times online editions and social media and so on, because there you had really actually a majority of US audience and a part of international audience. So the equation was to be able to speak to both audiences and be relevant to both audiences. So I'm not sure what those different audiences would take out from my cartoons, but of course, a US reader would see cartoons and analysis and criticism of US politics with a different perspective. And I hope that I would bring international readers an understanding of US politics that was more subtle than just, the anti-American stance, which is very basic and very prevalent, especially in French intellectuals, for example. So some ideas that would work very well in a French newspaper about Trump or before him, Bush, would not work so well with my American employers, and they would tell me, this is not so subtle. You could, there's a more subtle way to tackle this. So I got really, what has always interested me in this job is the interaction with the audience, but also the interaction with the newsroom, and I love the exchange. So that's a reason why I have always, I don't know how you practice, but I have always sent out different sketches. I'm not one who would say, I send my final cartoon and you take it or you leave it. I am interested in the feedback. So what I'm asking my employers, actually, it's a lot of modesty, is to look at different sketches and vote. I would have different people in the newsroom at the New York Times, and I would create an online poll so they would vote on my different sketches. And then ideally we would have, it's not just the number of things, right? I'm not just interested in the result of what works best, but we would have a discussion on the cartoon, on the merits of this idea versus this one, and why this one would work better than that one. And I would need a collaborative process like this, precisely because English is not my mother language, and I'm not from an American culture. So I've always been very interested in that exchange of cultures and ideas, and that has always been a part of my work process.
That's so interesting. One of the talking about the difference in perception between operating in Europe and in the U.S. and two different countries. I was in the UK for about a decade or longer, right at the time of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And one of the curious things I saw was how the British and European cartoonists drew Ronald Reagan in comparison to how the American cartoonists drew Ronald Reagan. And I'm not talking about what they caricatured, but it was more fundamental. The people in the UK and Europe mostly drew him as an evil character. Slitty eyes, frowned in front, bit of a grimace the whole time. In America, they drew him as this dumb guy, airheaded guy, eyebrows up like this, and he was just kind of lost as this kind of fumbling character. And I thought that was a really interesting, strong contrast between the two ways they are perceived. Well, I wanted to bring in something else, because all the cartoons we've been referring to now are your classic ones that people think about. Single panel, maybe a couple panels, peer publications. But one of the work that you've done that separates you from so many people practicing today is that at heart you're a journalist, and you have done a lot of cartoon journalism where you've decided to take a deep dive into a subject and treat it in a more profound and larger way. You've done animations, you've done virtual graphic novels. You've done in-depth exercises about big issues in the U.S., like the death penalty and now the border of Mexico. Yeah. First of all, I'm really interested in, number one, why do you do those things? And number two, either pick one or two that you want to talk about, or a favorite, or what you're going to do next. I mean, just share with the audience these kind of things you've been doing.
Yes, true. I've been doing, how are we going to call it? Comics journalism, graphic journalism, reportage. What is the right word?
Reportage sounds better coming from your mouth.
With the French accent.
With the French accent.
For the last 25 years, and I actually had a sense early on reading actually a French comics author who's not very well known, and he would use comics to tell stories, real stories. And I could, Jean Telet is his name, he has become a writer now, but he would publish in Casterman editions stories about people, about characters, real stories. So he would go, he would visit them, and he would translate that into comics. And I found that this was a very efficient way to tell stories, news stories. So I got that intuition, and I wanted to do this. And I was already a political cartoonist, moved to New York. That was a long time ago, Kal, 1995. And I started doing this because by that time, I had an editor in the newspaper I was working with in Switzerland who was interested in that. He was also a fan of Jean Telet, and we were both thinking we should bring that language to the news media and the print media. So he would give me 2-3 full pages of the newspaper, like we're talking about large pages, at the opening of the newspaper with the front page of the newspaper for me. And we would publish 2-3 times a year, those stories, like not long format stories. And at the same time, I discovered Joe Sacco. And he was doing exactly that in the world of comics. I was in the world of the media. I was mostly busy doing political cartoons. But if I had had a second life, I'm sure I would have spent that second life on doing comics reportage, because that's really something that I found fascinating. So I have to steal time on my schedule as political cartoonist to, come up with the stories, find the time to travel, cover the story. Over the last 25 years, I published maybe 40 stories. So we're talking about short-term, stories like magazine style, that kind of format. The project I did for the New York Times, 2015, that was interesting. It was a series for the web. You can still find it if you type nytimes.com/death row. And it's a 5-part series about death row in America with portraits of death row inmates. We were doing this project with my wife, Anne-Frédéric, while living in Los Angeles, traveling to death row prisons for 1 year, visiting death row inmates, and that was really fascinating. On the top of that, we did an exhibition project, an exhibition and documentary project, and the common point between all those things is you and I, because you're talking about animation and all forms of communication. That's exactly what you do, Kal. I mean, you are the most versatile of all cartoonists that I know. You and I, and many of us, just have that intuition that the power of the image, the power of cartoons, allow you to communicate in very different formats and different forms, and the possibilities are endless with the simple power of drawings. So be it in political cartoons, reportage, animation, or documentation, exhibition projects, I think we can find a lot of ways to tell stories and communicate to the audience. And if you want me to tell you, just between you and me,
I won't tell.
What my current project in that field is, well, all of us, we had many projects canceled, many things canceled in March, April. March was a very busy month for me. I was supposed to go to Mexico, and you know something about it, because that was a project, an exhibition project that I had set up. And the idea was I wanted to bring together some of the best US American cartoonists, and you are one of them, and part of the project, and some of the best Mexican cartoonists. And we were to meet in Ciudad Juarez by the wall. We had the authorization of the city to draw on the wall, and we wanted to have an exhibition with the Alliance Française in town about a view on the border, on the wall, on the issue of culture and cultural differences as seen by American and Mexican cartoonists. That was a great project. Plus, Cal, we would have met in a bar in Ciudad Juarez where I was told margarita was invented.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, we got to return to that place.
I know. So that exhibition was supposed to tour Mexico. It is now a virtual exhibition. We have your cartoons up there. We can give the link to that. It's not that exciting. It's virtual. So I was stuck in Switzerland, stuck in my studio. And then I got a call early March 7, from a guy in Geneva Hospital, who's a very good, very well-known epidemiologist. And he's the guy, by the way, who invented the hydroalcoholic gel that we are all using now, the gel, the solution that we are using. He's the guy who came up with that concept. He made a study because he found out that washing hands in the hospital context was not working, because the medical employees would not have the time to wash their hands as they should. So as a consequence, you know what happens, nosocomial, you have infections, in hospital infections. They were estimated at 16 million deaths a year due to in-hospital infections. Yeah. So that guy came up with that model. It was called the Geneva model. Anyway, he's calling me in March 7, telling me he needs my help and the help of fellow cartoonists to communicate. That's another field where cartoons can help. To communicate, especially to the youth, about the health, the measures that people need to take, like washing your hands, social distancing, because the youth, especially the teenagers, young adults, were not taking the message seriously enough. So he called me that day. We got something started here in Geneva and in France. I enrolled my fellow, cartoonists and YouTubers and humorists and people like that, stand-up comedians. So we helped him with the messaging. But what he told me also was what was happening in Italy. Beginning of March, that was not obvious. We didn't know that. It was not in the media, not yet, not even in the Italian media. And he told me, you don't realize, these are people that I work with. They're calling me from their hospitals and they're telling me it's horrible what's going on. And we are lowering the threshold of the age of people we cannot take care of anymore because we are overcrowded. So they were going down from 75 to 70 to now 65 years old. Beyond 65 years old, they would not be able to treat patients and put them on a ventilator. So I was really struck by this conversation. And from that moment, I got, I contacted him frequently. We got in touch, and then I talked to other people in Geneva Hospital. I chose to stick to Geneva Hospital. I talked to the head of the intensive care unit. And so I've been doing, as you can guess, a journal of those stories. And I am now planning, just between you and me, to make it a comic book by the end of the year.
Fantastic.
So I don't know. I have no idea on earth how I can be a political cartoonist full time, which is what I am right now, and have the silly idea of coming up with a comics book by the end of the year.
Right.
That's the plan.
Well, I think that's that speaks volumes to everyone listening of the magic of Patrick Chappatte, because you always are you have a million balls in the air, always moving forward. you're deeply engaged with the culture and politics, and you're trying to make the world a better place. I mean, you're using cartoons as that tool. So, Patrick, I always love talking with you because there's always going to be a surprise. There's going to be some more projects in the works. It's been great. Hope we'll get you back another time. There's a lot to talk about. Good luck with everything, and thanks for coming on. Satire Can Save Us All.
Good to see you, Kal. Good to see you again. Hope to see you in real life very soon.
I always so love talking to Patrick Chappatte. He's such a decent individual and a great cartoonist. I strongly urge all of you to go visit his website, chappatte.com, to see more of his work, particularly his his comic journalism stuff. So now we'll just have a quick conversation with our good friend Alexandra Bowman, who's got a new responsibility, and she had a question or two. So, Alexandra, welcome back to Satire Can Save Us All. So, you've been having an interesting new responsibility. You have been an admin for a Facebook page, which gathers cartoons together and displays them, right? And you've been doing it for about 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, roughly 2 weeks. So I'm one of 3 admins for the Facebook page Drawing Fire, and my job was to initially friend about 2,000 cartoonists and artists from around the internet, and then share their work to this page. As I go through my daily Facebook scrolling, if I see a cartoon I'd like to share, then I just click share, and it goes up and gets 50, 70 likes on the page. So
Gotcha.
Thanks to all of the people who are watching who are also members, and keep an eye out and support those cartoonists.
So I'm curious about your just kind of initial observations, because you're getting scores of cartoons come across your transom. What do you think about what you're seeing about how the cartoon is doing?
Yeah, well, one ongoing trope that I've seen is that cartoonists tend to take a quote or an action, like something that Trump in particular, has literally done, and just display it. And I guess in terms of your expert cartoonist experience and theory, how does that fare with what satire is intended to do?
Well, I think the thing about that is you're assuming that your audience agrees with you, and that when presented just with the facts, it's enough to them blow their brains off. And I think that to be a really memorable cartoon or piece of satire, you're going to try to win over the people that may not necessarily agree with you, or the people who are kind of in somewhere in the middle. And so it means that you probably need to do a little bit more than that. But I also will say I'm going to give, I'm sympathetic to the cartoonist cause in that people don't realize how hard it is to do this day in, day out, and come up with fresh ideas all the time. And you're not always going to do your top grade every day, but you aspire to do that. And I know that pretty much when a story breaks, I can probably tell you what a lot of my cartoonist colleagues are going to do. You just kind of know how certain people look at the stories. But the great ones are the ones who always surprise you. I mean, always surprise you. Story comes out, and then you see that they're just taking that little further twist, taking that obviously story, adding a little something to it, maybe doing an interesting design or drawing, or just keeping it fresh all the time. And when you're doing thousands of cartoons over a career, it's really hard to do that.
Like one that I saw that kind of did that, where it took the joke or a thing that Trump did and took it a step further. I saw several, but it had like Trump saying, forget science, forget the experts. I'd go back to the traditional warrior methods of healing or preventing the virus. And then it showed him covered in leeches.
Oh, right. Yeah, so there you go. Beautifully done. So I'm going to be really interested in hearing more of your observations, partly because you do cartoons yourself. You just won a national award, which is great. Congrats on that. And that you're learning from looking at other cartoonists. And this is the way that all satirists work, because there's no school for satire. We all learn from each other. So I'm going to be really interested in the lessons that you're picking up. And of course, here to answer your questions anytime.
Thank you. See you soon.
All right. Take care. Well, there's only one more thing left for us to do, and that is to chat with our Muppet in Chief, Mr. Bowser McSchnauzer. Now, I tell you what, I got some bad news. I just got a text from him a minute ago saying that he couldn't show up. You see, we had a stay-at-home order here at Maryland lifted by our governor, and I sent him out on assignment to see if people are wearing their masks out in public. I got a text from him from the beach saying that he needed to do some more research and it may be a week before he gets back to us. Well, I'm pretty sure that he's having a good time down there, and I hope that he comes back next week, and I also hope that you come back next week. We've got lots of interviews lined up. You can see some of our things on our YouTube channel, which is basically youtube.com. Search for Satire Can Save Us All. So in the meantime, look after yourselves, stay safe, stay sane, and we look forward to talking to you more here at Satire Can Save Us All. Take care.